Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan O'Donnell. I'm the lead investigator of the RAVEN project, which stands for Rural Action and Voices for the Environment at the University of New Brunswick, and we're hosting the event. I'm also an adjunct professor at St. Thomas University, and I'm the panel moderator. The panel co-hosts are the Environment and Society program at St. Thomas University, Prevent Cancer Now, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, or CRED-NB, and the NB Media Co-op. Before introducing the panelists, I have some opening remarks. I'm in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and when I look out the window, I can see Woolastock, the St. John River. A few years ago, an elder from one of the Woolastake communities told me that when he was a boy, he could drink the water directly from Woolastock, and nobody can do that safely now. And there's no salmon fishing in the river anymore either. It's important to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this territory who kept the land and waters here pristine and in balance with the environment for tens of thousands of years. I'm grateful to hundreds of generations of Woolastoqiyik who did this. The Woolastoqiyik never surrendered or ceded their title to this land that is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. In only a few generations, we've recklessly denigrated the lands and waters to the extent that globally we're in a biodiversity crisis as well as a climate emergency. I imagine that most of us here today are concerned about the climate crisis. I know that many of us are actively working on climate action, and some of us here are working to identify which sources of energy will help guarantee a livable planet for many generations to come. We have many potential energy choices in New Brunswick, as elsewhere. And all our choices will involve mining to some degree, some minimal, and other energy choices have a huge mining impact. When we consider our energy options moving forward, we need to be mindful of the mining impact of our energy choices. Mining Watch Canada has an excellent set of resources from their conference 2 years ago called Can We Mine Our Way Out of the Climate Crisis? And that's a really important question. The energy we use in New Brunswick is using many minerals mined somewhere else. Those mines had and continue to have an impact on the environment and the nearby communities, which are often Indigenous communities. This afternoon, we'll discuss one particular element, uranium, a radioactive metal. Uranium is necessary in the fuel to generate nuclear energy. All mining disrupts the natural balance of the earth, but uranium mining is in a category of its own, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We already have nuclear energy in New Brunswick. There's one nuclear reactor at the NB Power Point LaPro Nuclear Generating Station on the Bay of Fundy, which is the picture behind me, that generates about 30% of our electricity supply. The LaPro plant uses natural uranium as fuel, and NB Power is planning to build more nuclear reactors on the LaPro site, and they will use some form of uranium or plutonium, a uranium derivative, as fuel. Elsewhere in Canada, Ontario has 18 nuclear power reactors generating more than 60% of that province's electricity supply. And Ontario is also developing more nuclear reactors to keep its industry going. All the existing nuclear power reactors in Canada use natural uranium as fuel. So today, our excellent panel will discuss many of these issues and more. I'll introduce them now and then explain the format. The first speaker is Dr. Gordon Edwards, president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility and an internationally recognized nuclear expert. Gordon has been writing and speaking about nuclear energy for more than 40 years. His mental archive is immense, as many of us working with him know. If you're not familiar with Gordon's website, I suggest you have a look, the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, ccnr.org. In addition to basic information, the website has detailed analyses of particular issues, as well as historical information you'll not find anywhere else. One recent addition to Gordon's website is links to all the resolutions made by Indigenous groups in Canada on nuclear issues. I've been working quite closely with Gordon for about 18 months now, and it's my pleasure to welcome him to the panel. Our second speaker is Lorraine Rekmans, co-editor of the book, This is My Homeland, Stories of the Effects of Nuclear Industries by People of the Serpent River First Nation and the North Shore of Lake Huron. The book is out of print, but Lorraine has kindly agreed to make a photocopy available, and I'll send out the link when the video of this session is up in a few days. The book was published by Serpent River First Nation, and Lorraine is a community member. Serpent River First Nation is near Elliot Lake, Ontario, where uranium was mined for almost 40 years. Since her book was published, Lorraine has continued to be an environmental activist. Earlier this year, Lorraine was elected president of the Green Party of Canada, which is a non-political position concerned primarily with party governance. I first met Lorraine at an event online last month and was delighted when she accepted my invitation to be on this panel. So welcome, Lorraine. And our third panelist is Dr. Tracy Glynn. Tracy teaches in the Environment and Society program and other departments at St. Thomas University, as well as the University of New Brunswick. One of her teaching methods is to encourage her students to take action, and Tracy herself is well known here in New Brunswick as a social justice activist. When doing research for this panel, I learned about the campaign in 2008 to raise awareness about uranium exploration and mining in New Brunswick, and I was not at all surprised to learn that Tracy was heavily involved in that campaign that she'll be talking about today. Tracy is a founding member and editor of the NB Media Co-op, which is one of our co-hosts here tonight, and she worked for 3 years on the Raven Project. Her research on mining includes her PhD on the community impacts of mining in Indonesia. She's on the board of Mining Watch Canada. I've worked with Tracy on many projects and activities over the years, and I'm so pleased she agreed to join us this afternoon. Welcome to Tracy. So more than 200 people have registered for the event today, and we currently, I think, have close to 100. I'll check in a minute in the session. Our chat master is Brinaine Lloyd from Northwatch, who I've been working with for more than a year now. Brinaine has extensive knowledge of nuclear issues from her many decades as an activist in Northern Ontario. So this will be the panel format. Each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes. If you have a question for the panel, write it in the Q&A. You'll see that option at the bottom of your computer screen or your smartphone screen. If you phoned in with voice only and you're not watching the video, the Q&A option is not available. The panel will respond to questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. The chat's for discussion. Everyone watching the video can upvote a question you like. You just go to the Q&A to see the questions that people will start to put in. If you like a question and you want it to be asked, you click on the thumbs up under the question to move it closer to the top of the list. And we'll ask the questions from the top down. So once again, use the Q&A for questions. Chat Master Brinaine will monitor the chat and encourage people to add questions to the Q&A. So Gordon, I'll just turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you today about uranium, a complicated subject. It's not just one substance, as it turns out, but actually hundreds, and I'll explain that. I'm talking about uranium as a shapeshifter. I just have to share my screen, and then we can get started. All right. I'm talking about uranium as a shapeshifter because, in fact, this is how it gives rise to literally hundreds of other, you might call them avatars. They're not products so much as they are changes of identity. Shapeshifting is what makes uranium insidiously dangerous because it's not just one element, it's many. Shapeshifting is the ability to physically transform oneself through an inherently superhuman ability. Now, there are 3 different dangerous transformations of uranium that take place. When we talk about uranium mining, the primary problem is the radioactive progeny or decay products of uranium, all of which are very dangerous, in fact, much more dangerous than uranium itself. But they're all actually starting off as uranium atoms. In nuclear reactors, we split uranium atoms and we produce hundreds, literally hundreds of brand new radioactive materials which were never found in nature before 1939, which are called fission products. In fact, it was the existence of these fission products which allowed scientists to recognize that something brand new had happened, that the uranium atom had been split. And when it comes to weapons, the first nuclear reactors were actually built for the purpose of transforming uranium into plutonium. And plutonium has become the principal nuclear explosive in the world's nuclear arsenals. I put down here transuranic actinides. because there's actually about 36 different materials, all heavier than uranium, all of which start off as uranium atoms, but they become heavier by absorbing neutrons and they transform into new elements. Now, here's a model of the uranium atom. These photographs are by my good friend, Robert Del Tredici. Uranium is the key element in all nuclear fission technology. It's important to understand that there would be no nuclear bombs or nuclear weapons of any description, nor would there be any nuclear reactors of any description if it were not for uranium. Uranium is the key material in these technologies. And in 1943, Canada formalized its participation in the World War II atomic bomb program. The Prime Minister of Canada got together with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Churchill, in Quebec, and they signed an agreement to cooperate in building the world's first atomic bombs. Now, why was Canada particularly involved in this? Well, basically, Canada had the only readily accessible supply of uranium, the key ingredient. And this actually was in the land of the Satu Dene people, a nomadic people who had lived for thousands of years around the shores of Great Bear Lake, way up high in the just subarctic, about 100 miles south of the Arctic Circle. And it was on the east arm of the Great Slave Lake that there was a mine, which we knew about for a reason which I will explain shortly. These are bags that they used to carry on their backs to carry the radioactive ore, the Dene people. And Dene, the town of Delaney is now sometimes referred to as the village of widows, because so many people died of radiation-induced illnesses. And it's not as if they didn't know about these illnesses ahead of time. As early as 1931, way before the Second World War, there was a Department of Mines document which talked about lung cancer, bone cancer, and deadly anemia, which can be caused by very small amounts of radioactive substances deposited in the cell tissue or bone structure of the body. This was because of tragic events that occurred in the early 20th century, which I'll shortly be talking about. So it was already well known. Don't let anybody tell you that they didn't know the dangers of these materials, and they did. Now, Canada became, because of these historical accidents, it became the world's first and most important supplier and exporter of uranium in the world. And up until about 4 or 5 years ago, it was the #1 and had been the #1 since the World War II atomic bomb program. Delaney is way up at the top of the screen there in a place called Port Radium. The Elliot Lake region is at the top of Lake Huron. You can see the blown up circles there. That's where the Serpent River band was at the foot of the Serpent River. That whole system became very contaminated with radioactive byproducts of uranium mining, which Lorraine will be talking about. And all of this material went down to a town called Port Hope, Ontario, where it was refined for the atomic bomb project and also for the Cold War buildup of nuclear weapons, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, all of which had a significant amount of Canadian uranium in them, either in the form of uranium or in the form of plutonium. Here's the utilization of Canadian uranium based upon the mill, where the location of the mill is. You can see that a lot of these mills produce materials only for bombs. In fact, all Canadian uranium was sold for nuclear weapons up until 1965. Only then did the Canadian government announce that it would no longer sell uranium for weapons purposes, but for peaceful purposes, meaning nuclear reactors. Now, the first example of shape-shifting comes about through a process called radioactivity. It's a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. Nuclear energy refers to energy that comes directly from the nucleus of an atom. And it turns out that the nucleus of the atom is held together by the strongest force in the universe, called the strong nuclear force. This process of radioactivity was discovered 125 years ago by a man named Henri Becquerel in Paris. And the unit of radioactivity is therefore called a becquerel. And it refers to 1 disintegration per second. So here's a picture of Henri Becquerel. He was interested in things that glowed in the dark. And uranium was particularly unusual because no matter how long you put it in a dark place for weeks or months, it would still continue to cause glowing in the dark. A kind of an invisible light was being given off by these rocks. Now, radioactive disintegration involves the disintegration or explosion of a nucleus, giving off subatomic shrapnel, you might say. And the three types that are most common are the alpha particle, the beta particle, and the gamma ray. These are all very dangerous to living cells of all kinds. And the number of disintegrations per second is measured in becquerels. And the half-life of a radioactive material is how long it takes for half of the atoms to disintegrate. That means the other half is still there, and it will take another half-life for half of those to disintegrate. And so it goes on and on and on. After 10 half-lives, you've reduced the amount of radioactive substance by approximately a factor of 1,000. Now, radioactivity is dangerous, and the people who mine uranium aren't really concerned so much about the dangers. That's just a nuisance to them. What they want to get is the uranium, to use it either as a fuel or as an explosive. But the people who are the innocent bystanders, they have to be concerned about the health effects of radioactivity. Chronic exposure increases the incidence of cancer, leukemia, genetic damage, also strokes, heart attacks, and other blood diseases such as anemia that Marie Curie died of and her daughter Irene, and even of low intelligence in young children who have been exposed in the womb. But there is a latency period. The onset of disease may occur years or decades after exposure. It's very similar to cigarette smoking. You don't see people smoke a cigarette and then keel over dead. It takes a while. And the same thing happens with radiation. So the effects are many years later, and consequently are subtle. They're not easily detected unless you go looking for them very carefully. You can't see radioactivity, but if you put it in a special device called a cloud chamber, you can actually see the tracks of these particles that are being given off all the time. So it's constantly emitting this invisible, you can't taste it, you can't see it, you can't smell it. There's nothing you can do except experience the ill effects of it. And unless you have special equipment, you won't even know that radioactivity exists because it just looks like normal, inert material, but it's not. Now, Marie Curie discovered something very interesting. She crushed up the ore that Becquerel had used just 2 years later, and she took away the uranium. She extracted the uranium chemically. She was a very good chemist. And she found to her amazement that while uranium is indeed radioactive, the residues are much more radioactive. In fact, 85% of the radioactivity is left in the crushed rock from which the uranium has been extracted. And that's true today at every uranium mine in the world. When they extract uranium, they take away the uranium, but they leave 85% of the radioactivity behind. So Marie Curie knew that there must be other materials there which are even more radioactive than uranium. She discovered two of them, radium and polonium. She named polonium after her homeland of Poland. Each disintegration, it turns out, creates a new element called a decay product. So when a uranium atom disintegrates, it doesn't disappear, it transforms itself. That's why I call it a shapeshifter. It turns out that every atom of radium started off as an atom of uranium. And every atom of radon gas started off as an atom of radium, which in turn started off as an atom of uranium. So all of these things are, in my view, they're magical transformations of the uranium atom. They're not produced by the uranium atom. They're new identities. They're new avatars, you might say, of the uranium atom. Uranium has a long decay chain with about 24 progeny. Its decay products are much more radioactive than uranium itself. Now, radium, which Marie Curie discovered, by the 1920s, it was recognized that this is an extremely dangerous material. In fact, they used the danger of the material, the fact that it kills tissues so easily, to fight cancer, because they could burn the cancerous growth and shrink it down. But unfortunately, these young women, who were mostly young teenagers, almost all of them before the age of 20, thousands of them worked painting luminous dials on watches, and they died of a host of diseases. By the 1920s, it was clear that there was an epidemic of bone cancer among these girls, as well as fatal anemia. And they got anemias, bone cancers, and later on in life, they developed head cancers. And all of these were caused by very tiny amounts of radium, so tiny that the chemical methods of the time would be unable to identify it. It was only through the radioactive emissions that they were able to actually find out how much radium was in their body. It was a few micrograms in each case. Radon is another thing that was discovered by the 1930s. It was well known that thousands of miners had been dying for centuries as a result of radon gas in underground mines. And that's been well documented around the world, and particularly here in Canada. There have been great improvements made in controlling the radon in mines today so that miners are not exposed to such high levels as they used to be, but it still causes lung cancer. And the only reason there has been improvements is because of public action. If the public and the workers don't speak out, nothing gets done. Here's another example. Polonium-210, which Marie Curie discovered, was used to murder Alexander Litvinenko in 2006. This is a Russian ex-KGB agent in London, England. They put a little polonium in his tea and that did him in. Now, polonium, it turns out, is responsible for up to 90% of the deaths attributed to tobacco smoking. It turns out that radioactive polonium finds its way into the tobacco that is harvested. And then when the smokers light up their cigarettes, they're breathing polonium into their lungs. And polonium, it turns out, weight by weight, is about 250 billion times more toxic than hydrogen cyanide, one of the most toxic chemical poisons that we know of. 250 billion times. That means if you had the same amount of polonium-210 as you did of cyanide, you would kill 250 billion more people with the polonium. By the way, these deadly radionuclides, radium, radon, and polonium, are all alpha emitters, and so are uranium and plutonium. Alpha emitters don't have much penetrating paper. They won't go through, they don't have much penetrating power. Alpha particles won't go through a sheet of paper, but they do enormous harm inside the body. This star is the tracks of alpha emissions from a tiny speck of plutonium in the lung tissue of an ape. And that happens over 48 hours, those tracks. So when uranium-238 is mined, you only take away the uranium, you leave all the other materials behind, and 85%, as I said before, is left in the uranium tailings. Here's a wall of uranium tailings, 30 feet high at Elliot Lake. There's about 70 million tons of radioactive sand behind that wall, containing all of those byproducts of uranium. In the voluminous uranium tailings, thorium-230, which has a half-life of 76,000 years, that's one of the byproducts, reproduces the radium, radon, and polonium for hundreds of thousands of years. So this becomes a perennial, an eternal problem for the environment. The uranium mill tailings hazards are multiple. There's the gas that's given off, there's the seepage into the groundwater, there's the dust blowing through the air. And so over the centuries, this stuff spreads and remains deadly poisonous for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, I'm just going to mention two other things briefly. The second example of shapeshifting is in a nuclear reactor, where, as I said before, when the uranium atoms are split, you get all the broken pieces of uranium atoms. These are more avatars of uranium. So when you hear about a radioactive accident like Fukushima or Chernobyl, where all this radioactive poison is going into the air, guess what? Those are all the broken pieces of uranium atoms that probably came from Saskatchewan. And the third example of shapeshifting is how plutonium and other transuranics are created. And I will end up there. I just think it's important for people to realize that don't be bamboozled. When people say that uranium is not the most hazardous material, they're right. But it spawns hundreds of other materials which are far more hazardous. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Okay, now I'm going to ask Lorraine Rekmans to go ahead. Lorraine, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Susan. First, I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, and just acknowledge the land of my ancestors, the home of my family, and now the home of my grandchildren. So miigwech for being here. Yeah, so I have a long history, I think, going back to the late 1980s and dealing with the subject of uranium mining. My father worked at Denison Mines at Elliot Lake, and my mother was from the Serpent River First Nation. And because of the Indian Act, we were not allowed to live on the reserve because my father was a Frenchman. So when Indigenous women married outside of the Indigenous community, they lost their status and they were forced off the reserve. So I grew up, I was born and raised in Elliot Lake, where my father worked at the uranium mines. And I grew up, enmeshed in everything nuclear, living in a town that celebrated the atom, living in a town that, had hockey teams called the Atoms. We had a uranium festival. The whole community was built around its celebration of everything nuclear. And there was a lot of pride in the community. People, thought it was the uranium capital of the world and celebrated their contributions to nuclear energy and medicine. It wasn't until the 1990s and the decommissioning hearings that many of the miners discovered the relationship that their work had to the weapons industry. So a little bit about the area where these mines occurred. So there were 12 mines. This is Robinson Huron Treaty Territory. The Robinson Huron Treaty was signed in 1850. There were 17 First Nation signatories to that treaty area, which spans from Sault Ste. Marie to Penetanguishing and north to the height of land where the water begins to flow the other way. So it's I think an assault on that relationship. What happened at Elliot Lake, the destroying of 10 lakes, dumping of nuclear waste, effluent discharge into the Serpent River watershed, and destruction of the traditional territory. It's something that I always say when I speak, that is something that was never factored into the cost of uranium. We were told, that nuclear energy was going to be too cheap to meter, that it would just be such a benefit to society, but the cost was completely subsidized. So this, I think the whole industry there was industrial maneuvering and political posturing and collaboration across industry and government. It was almost, I would call it carefully coordinated collusions. But so you could see, there were political reasons for keeping the mines open in Elliot Lake, even in the 1960s when the price of uranium dropped out. They were mining to stockpile. It's a long story. It goes back to 1955. But the short of it is that 10 lakes were destroyed in the production of nuclear waste. And I get chills when I listen to Gordon talk, about the decay chain, because what we're looking at is millions of tons of radioactive waste that have been left behind from decades of mining. I'll start off where I engaged fully was in the decommissioning process. So this was the first time in the history of Canada that uranium mines were being decommissioned. And I was a young journalist working at the newspaper in Elliot Lake, and I engaged with a local women's group. And we were attempting to bring Indigenous voices into the decommissioning process. And this was the early days of when consultation was just beginning. So it was just quite a political struggle to even get engaged. And at the end of it, I have to say, to no effect. It was a lot of work as a community group to try to input into the consultation process and how mines were being decommissioned. And what was determined was that they would put a water cover over the tailings. So the tailings had been left the entire time that I was growing up had been left blowing over the community and migrating into the Serpent River watershed untreated. So in the decommissioning of the mines, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency determined that it would be an adequate solution to flood the tailings, maintain a water cover in perpetuity, and just hold the tailings back with dams. And at present, there are 64 dams holding back the tailings at Elliot Lake, so millions of tons. And as far as I understand, the effluent that runs off is treated with lime to neutralize the sulfuric acid, and that brings the pH levels down in the runoff. And I'm pretty sure, based on the data that I've seen and the lack, I guess, or the lack of the need to keep adding lime, that much of the sulfuric acid has migrated from the tailing site, leaving behind all the waste products from mining. So as Gordon said, radioactive rock. So the mines actually would mine 1 ton of rock and crush it. 1 ton of rock and crush it, and then leach the uranium out with sulfuric acid. And from that, they would extract 1 pound of uranium. So that was tons and tons of rocks. The Department of Indian Affairs decided in the 1950s to build a sulfuric acid plant at Serpent River First Nation. And because it was really a central location to several mines. So there were mines at Agnew Lake, mines at just east of Blind River, and mines in Elliot Lake. And the sulfuric acid plant had the freshwater source from Lake Huron. So it was situated, the sulfuric acid plant was situated right in the heart of the village. And the land was taken by the Department of Indian Affairs and leased to Noranda. And then it was sold as a job creation opportunity for the Ojibwe people at Serpent River. So the site now is completely contaminated, and it is still subject of many environmental studies. It was going back to the 70s, the First Nation tried to have the Department of Indian Affairs address the contamination and clean up the site. At one point, the military was actually called in to demolish the sulfuric acid plant by using explosives. And so the contamination, of course, was spread around, and you could see evidence of sulfuric acid contamination on the shore. My mother told me stories that, they would hang their clothes when the plant was operational, that they would hang their clothes on the line and come in at the end of the day, and their clothes would have holes in them. And that the people who worked at the mine, or at the sulfuric acid plant, you could see that their money had actually been discolored. You could always tell, she said, you could always tell who was working at the plant. So I think the issue is just sort of negating any Indigenous interests or rights in the land. To me, I've talked to elders that have since passed, and they said in the early days, when the mine waste was completely just untreated and disposed of in the lakes, animals would be found dead around the perimeter of those lakes. And elders told me that when they saw that destruction, they just dropped to their knees. There were no words for what they saw being done. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that we could sacrifice 10 lakes for an ore grade that was so low that you'd have to take out a ton of rock just to get 1 pound of uranium. Anyway, so when I think what struck me when Gordon was talking was this bamboozlement, the bamboozling that goes on. And even as a young journalist, when I started to write stories about untreated effluent leaving the waste management areas, people from the nuclear industry and the mining industry would intimidate and harass me. And they would, tell me that I didn't understand nuclear energy. They really tried to mystify the science, and lay people couldn't really, understand something so complex. But we saw the discoloration, that the sulfuric acid was causing. We just knew it was wrong. We knew it was wrong to take up 10 lakes and fill them with nuclear waste, cover them with water and walk away. Didn't have to be a scientist to figure out this was a bad idea. I think that's, what I want to say to people is that don't let them mystify you, right? If you've got any common sense, this is not sustainable. The nuclear industry knew that mining uranium was dangerous, but they did not tell the workers. They did not inform the workers. It was a cover-up. In the 1970s, the miners went on a wildcat strike. I heard from the head of the union at the time. They were at a conference. They were at an international conference, and they discovered the scientific paper had been out for decades. And they came home and told the miners that this was dangerous. So they were crying for increased ventilation and dosimeter badges and monitoring. My father said they did have a company doctor, so you would be required on occasion to visit the company doctor. And he said they would give you an X-ray, and if they saw anything, you would be let go. That was health and safety. I think that what really troubled me is that I think the political engagement, the political involvement, and I talked about collaboration and collusion, the fact that the Department of Indian Affairs was used to appropriate land from an Indian reserve to locate a sulfuric acid plant, contaminate the entire village, put the health of all the Indigenous people at risk. And there was absolutely no benefit to the community from any of the production. And the nuclear industry at Elliot Lake was worth billions of dollars. There's a few good books. There's The Electric Empire by Peter McKay. I think that, talks a little bit about the industry and how it worked. And there is another book about Stephen Roman, I think, and it talks about the history of Elliot Lake and who was implicated in the mess, I guess I would call it. What troubles me to this day, I think, is those 64 dams, especially after what happened at the Mount Poly disaster. That dams, through the environmental assessment in the 1990s, the environmental assessment agency said, it's not a question of if those dams will fail, it's just a question of when they will fail. And we know, as we age, we look at crumbling infrastructure in Canada, and we look at the resources, the strain on the resources that we have to maintain those dams and those waste sites in perpetuity is too high of a cost to pay for electricity. Someone once described a reactor to me as a fancy and expensive way to boil water. And I thought, yes, how wasteful. And speaking of water, this is a water consumptive industry. So maintaining that water cover, those dams were built before any real discussion began about climate change. There was no consideration about how to maintain a water cover on those tailings in perpetuity, given that we may face extreme drought situations, given that we might face any number of climate catastrophes. Those dams are really close to the north shore of Lake Huron. There is a excuse me, there is a uranium refinery at Blind River, Ontario, also that is impacting on water quality of Lake Huron by releasing effluent from that refinery into the water system. Yeah, it's not a good story, but I think it really should be a story of resistance, common sense, and action, to say to Canadians, this isn't acceptable, that we cannot continue to contaminate our ecosystems just to produce energy. We cannot continue to infringe on Indigenous territories without compensation or consideration. That exploitation and devastation of traditional lands has a cost, and it has to be factored into production. So this is, to me, people talk about environmental racism, and this is what it was. This is there was no regard for the impact of the people at Serpent River First Nation by putting this sulfuric acid plant right in the heart of the village. Okay, good.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, for your sobering message, and very appreciative that you were able to join us here today. Okay, we're going to move now to Tracy Glynn. Tracy, just a second. I just want to mention that this event is scheduled for 90 minutes, so we will have lots of time for Q&A after. So Tracy, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to Susan O'Donnell for inviting me to share the story of the 2008 campaign against uranium mining in New Brunswick. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I am on the stolen lands of the Wostaquawi, the Pascota Mukati, and the Mi'kmaq. When I refer to private property and Crown lands in this talk, I'm really talking about land that was never surrendered by the Indigenous peoples of the Wabanaki. So back in 2007, uranium prices were skyrocketing, as were uranium claims in New Brunswick. Previously in the province, prospectors staked an average of about 3,000 new claims a year. But by just mid-2007, more than 12,000 claims have been staked, and an estimated 2/3 of those were for uranium. So more and more property owners were shocked to learn that their properties had been staked and that the government was not required to notify them of the claim. They were noticing blue ribbons on their land, and that's how many came to know that their land had been staked for uranium. People were also shocked to learn that they had very limited subsurface rights to their properties. All minerals, metals beneath their private property belong to the Crown. And while mining companies are required to reach some kind of settlement with property owners, the companies can still proceed with prospecting and mining activities in cases where the minerals are not directly underneath their homes or backyards. So then, I'm just going back. So then Natural Resources Minister Donald Arsenault, who is currently vying to be the next Liberal Party leader and Premier of New Brunswick, he told the media, "We can't just let this boat pass by." So at the time, the New Brunswick Liberal government under Sean Graham was promoting what they called a self-sufficiency agenda, and uranium was part of that agenda. The entire self-sufficiency agenda was protested by different sectors of civil society in New Brunswick, unions, environmental groups concerned about privatization of public services and the government's promotion of yesterday's energy sources, fossil fuels and nuclear. So people were opposed to the self-sufficiency agenda. So a number of mining companies were actively looking for uranium deposits in the province, and some of them are getting exploration funding from the provincial government to look for the radioactive mineral. So one of the most controversial uranium claims involved a claim in the Moncton watershed by one of the world's largest mining companies, then called CVRD Inco, today known as Vale, one of the world's largest mining companies. The company had just received a failing grade in the Globe and Mail's Corporate Social Responsibility Survey for environmental and social impacts of their global operations. And now this company wanted to explore for uranium in Moncton's watershed that provides water to some 100,000 residents. So in June 2007, New Brunswick signed a $4 million deal with CVRD Inco, giving the company exclusive 5-year prospecting rights on 136,000 hectare parcel of land between Sussex and Moncton. So Moncton residents opposed the prospecting in their area for fear that a mine could contaminate their watershed. People mobilized across the province to ban uranium mining. At the time, I was working at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, myself, David Kuhn, Inka Malevsky, all with the Conservation Council at the time. We were regularly commenting in the media about uranium. Inka Malevsky wrote a fact sheet on the environmental and health impacts of uranium that was disseminated across the province. Government assurances that there would be an environmental impact assessment were not reassuring at all. We knew that the environmental impact assessment process in New Brunswick was outdated and inadequate, and definitely not stringent enough to protect our environment from uranium mining. So the Conservation Council, along with 30 other groups in New Brunswick, including churches and farmers groups, called for an immediate ban on uranium exploration and mining. We pointed to moratoriums against uranium already in place, like the 20-year one in Nova Scotia and the more recent one in British Columbia. We organized a letter campaign to mayors and members of the Legislative Assembly, calling on them to support a moratorium on uranium exploration and mining. Several mayors and municipalities supported our request and called for uranium bans. Letters against uranium exploration and mining filled the editorial pages of newspapers. I recall that the Irving newspaper in Moncton, the Times and Transcript, had to change its headlines for the same stories published in their provincial paper. So the headlines in the Moncton newspapers were more friendly to the opposition. So they knew their readers, Moncton residents, were not having uranium exploration or mining in their watershed. So at the provincial level, I recall a number of progressive conservative opposition members supported our call. The opposition also called on the Graham Liberal government to hold a referendum on mining, on uranium mining, but the government refused. So we made uranium to a key part of the campaign for nuclear-free New Brunswick. We knew that companies were interested in New Brunswick's uranium deposits because of the rising price of the mineral due to a renewed global interest in nuclear power as a potential clean energy source. We did not agree that nuclear power was part of our clean energy future, considering the impacts of nuclear power generation from cradle to grave. At the time, the Premier, Sean Graham, and his government were considering the construction of a second nuclear reactor at the Point Lepreau nuclear power station near St. John. That project did not go ahead. Some other things that we did, we organized public talks by rock stars in the anti-uranium and anti-nuclear movement. They came to New Brunswick and told us about severe contamination that uranium mining had caused in Saskatchewan and elsewhere. They included author Jim Harding, who had just published his book, Canada's Deadly Secret, Saskatchewan Uranium and the Global Nuclear System, Dr. Helen Caldecott, a physician, and Gordon Edwards with us today, also joined us to talk about the dangers of nuclear energy. We spoke in packed public places. Inka Malevsky and I traveled to Harvey near Fredericton to talk to, I remember, a very worried audience in a church hall. Harvey was one of the hot spots for uranium exploration. A number of people in attendance had property that had been staked. Inka and I also spoke at a packed Capitol Theater in Moncton to residents there concerned about uranium exploration in the Turtle Creek watershed. So the response from government, specifically from Natural Resources Minister Donald Arsenault, pictured here, was that a vocal minority opposed to uranium exploration and a silent majority actually supported it. So according to the minister, uranium exploration was going to bring economic benefits to the province, and we knew that wasn't the case. Minister Arsenault said that government public information sessions would help the public understand the exploration and mining of uranium. Well, the public information session in Fredericton on June 4, 2008, pictured here on the left, was nothing like I had ever witnessed before. And I've been to my fair share of public information sessions. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium at the Hugh John Fleming Forestry Complex in Fredericton. Government officials could barely speak. People had had enough. They were not going to be told that there would be no impact like they had been told before, only to wake up to a nightmare of a clear cut or of no water, like what the people of Penobscot, affected by gas operations, were experiencing at the time. So New Brunswick never did implement a moratorium or a ban on uranium. The government put into place an e-claim system where people could view maps that showed the location of mineral claims tenures throughout New Brunswick. Maybe they made it easier for some residents to access this information, but I know many rural residents did not have access to this online map. Then in May 2008, the New Brunswick government announced guidelines for companies exploring for uranium in the province. The guidelines included testing wells within 500 meters of drill sites, and the companies were also required to seal radioactive material back into the ground. Folks were concerned that the province was not requiring inspectors to be at the drilling sites to ensure that companies were actually following the guidelines. And also people were concerned that there was no setback for exploratory drilling near domestic water wells. I have to say that the greatest weapon in our arsenal against uranium mining, pardon the battle metaphor, but I have to say that it was Inka Milewski. Inka grew up in the uranium town of Elliot Lake, already a well-known protector of the environment in New Brunswick. I call her New Brunswick's Rachel Carson. Both are marine biologists and environmental health champions. So Inka has supported the Belledune residents in northern New Brunswick with her scientific knowledge, producing studies that revealed lead contamination in the soils from the cluster of industrial activities there. So on uranium, the government of New Brunswick, couldn't stand a chance with against Inka Milewski. Inka, who knew full well the impacts of uranium, not just because she's a scientist who studies pollution and health impacts, but also because she had lived the impacts of uranium. So as Lorraine pointed out, Elliot Lake is an area affected by widespread cancer linked to uranium mining. Inka's family lived on Elliot Lake's Poplar Road. Canada's full of these cancer alleys, and Poplar Road is one of them. Inka's father was a uranium miner. He, like so many uranium miners, died of lung cancer that eventually spread to his brain. In 2007, when a professor at the University of New Brunswick's chemical engineering department said that uranium mining can sustain a community without destroying it, Inka responded with an editorial in the Daily Gleaner. She pointed out that uranium mining in Elliot Lake had left behind a toxic legacy of lakes, rivers, soil, and wildlife contaminated with high levels of radium-226, a known carcinogen. Inka pointed out that cancer was not restricted to miners. She said she knows this because her mother died of cancer, as did many other wives of uranium miners. So Inka handed us the science. She produced that first fact sheet that mobilized people across the province against uranium. Never underestimate the power of a good fact sheet. So Inka pointed out that we have known for decades the links between cancer and uranium mining, just as was pointed out by Gordon and Lorraine. But as they've also pointed out, the warnings went unheeded by many governments, many places for years. Miners in Elliot Lake died due to the radon exposure. And just before their deaths, they had to fight for workplace compensation, jumping through so many hoops to prove that they were eligible, and sometimes they won only to die shortly after. So Inka told the media, "I'd like to invite Donald Arsenault on a tour of my Elliot Lake, and we'll start with a cemetery. Then we'll move to the massive tailing piles left behind that have virtually poisoned many of the rivers that flow into the Great Lakes." Just like how folks were questioning the government of New Brunswick for being unable to protect us from shale gas at the exact same time that they were failing the people of Penobscot, already affected by mining and gas exploration, Inca was pointing out how the government was failing people in the Harvey area living with dangerous radioactive elements by not following up on recommended testing of residents in the Harvey area after high levels of radioactive radon gas were found in that area dating back to 1981. So last year, Larry Weiss wrote a piece for the ND Media Co-op pointing out that the current Higgs progressive conservative government was eyeing uranium exploration. Larry provided this map that shows locations of past exploration work on uranium claims. Larry pointed out that in several of these locations, the population is relatively dense and that drilled wells are the only source of water for people. So here we are again, needing to organize to protect water and health in the face of an industry that will cause irreversible damage if allowed to, and in the face of a government that continues to violate the treaties of peace and friendship and commit reckless exploitation, in the words of Madawaska Chief Patricia Bernard last week. So I just want to leave you with the lyrics of one of my favorite artists, Buffy Sainte-Marie. Buffy actually came to New Brunswick in 2008 during the peak of activity, mobilization against uranium. If you're a Buffy Sainte-Marie fan, you know that she has many songs about uranium, including the haunting song, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. But from the song, The Priest of Golden Bull, she sang, third worlders see it first, the dynamite, the dozers, the cancer, and the acid rain, the corporate caterpillars come into our backyards and turn the world to pocket change. Reservations are the nuclear frontline, uranium poison kills. We're starving in a handful of gluttons, we're drowning in their gravy spills. It's delicate confronting these priests of the golden bull. They preach from the pulpit of the bottom line, their minds wrestle with $1,000,000 bills. You say silver burns a hole in your pocket and gold burns a hole in your soul. Well, uranium burns a hole in forever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you for ending on that Buffy Sainte-Marie song. I remember when that album came out and I was listening to it and it just blew me away. So, and that was a great song to highlight. Okay, so we're going to the Q&A now. And interestingly enough, our both Gordon and Lorraine have been answering the questions in the Q&A, which is fantastic. So, but I know there's some people who can't access them, and we do have half an hour for Q&A. So I would invite everyone to put their questions in the Q&A. I'm going to go over some of the ones that have already been answered. But also, if for some reason you can't access your Q&A, you can send your question to the host and panelists through the chat. And I'll then ask Renee if she sees any of those to just ask them. So we're going to start with a question that Lorraine answered, but maybe you could, if you have more information, Lorraine, you could add it. So the question is, has there been a study in Ontario in communities around Pickering or the Bruce Peninsula, et cetera, to find out about leukemia rates and cancer, et cetera? So Lorraine, do you want to do that one?
Sure. Yeah. I think Atomic Energy Control Board did a study. So there was a study that came out of the UK that showed there were increases in childhood leukemia around nuclear facilities. So the question in Canada was, is there an increase in childhood leukemia next to nuclear facilities? So they did the study in 2 phases. And I know they included Port Hope. And incidentally, Port Hope at one time, there was a political promise to clean up the site at Port Hope by having all the radioactive waste from that area transferred to a host site. So that was the first of the low-level radioactive waste consultations, host site selection roadshows that began back in the early 90s. But anyway, the study was done in 2 phases, and it was interesting because it included Blind River. But I remember looking at the studies and thinking that there was something wrong with the methodology, because in Blind River, they were missing data for 1 year, which was, I think, the years just following the startup of the refinery there. So it raised some questions. And of course, the Atomic Energy Control Board concluded that there was no increase in childhood leukemia around Canadian nuclear facilities. So it's probably available, archived somewhere, but it was before this, I mean, this is the predecessor to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission.
Thank you, Lorraine, for that. Okay, so the next question that got voted up, Gordon, you answered this one, but maybe you could do it orally. How does plutonium get into the tobacco in such high amounts? Is it naturally occurring, or is it only due to the spread from the nuclear industry? Thank you.
Okay, the polonium gets into the tobacco primarily through the use of radioactive fertilizer. They sell radioactive fertilizer from Florida, and they also sell radioactive fertilizer from Blind River, from the Blind River refinery. And this radioactive fertilizer gives off radon gas, which builds up under the tobacco leaves. The tobacco has a very thick canopy of leaves. And when the radon gas hovers under the leaves, it disintegrates and produces lead-210, radioactive lead-210, which has a 22-year half-life. That deposits on the sticky hairs on the tobacco leaves and is harvested with the tobacco, so that when you buy the tobacco in the store, you're actually buying a small amount of lead-210. Lead-210 provides a continual supply of polonium-210, so that as the smoker smokes, he's inhaling polonium-210, and when he's not smoking, the smoke goes into the air as secondhand smoke, which carries the polonium-210 to others in the room. And so 90% approximately, and these are not anti-nuclear people who are saying this. The Health Physics Society of America is part of the nuclear industry. And they say that up to 90% of the deaths from cigarette smoking attributed to cigarette smoking are actually from this radioactive polonium, which comes primarily from the radioactive fertilizer. And we're selling it right now from Blind River as a byproduct that they're trying to make a buck on.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. The next question, you also answered it, which is about, can you talk about the effects of uranium on Port Hope, Ontario? Thank you.
Yeah, Port Hope is a real tragedy for that community because it's a beautiful little town, one of the prettiest towns on the shore of Lake Ontario, but they dumped over 2.5 million cubic meters of radioactive waste into open ravines, into harbors, into ditches, into the public beach. And they also used large quantities of this material to build roads and to build homes, including schools. Hundreds of homes and schools have had to be, not homes and schools, hundreds of buildings have had to be demolished because the radon levels that build up inside those homes as a result of the use of radioactive building materials is so high. Right now, as Lorraine said, there was a process. For 8 years, there was a federal siting task force which searched all over Ontario to find a willing host community for the Port Hope waste. And they came up empty-handed, despite spending millions of dollars and spending all those years. They came up empty-handed. Nobody wanted it. And the result is they're now building 2 giant mounds less than 3 kilometers from the shore of Lake Ontario, in which they're going to house all this waste, which will remain dangerous for thousands of years. And actually, they're claiming that this is a wonderful facility. It's actually a booby prize. It's a booby prize because the reason they were searching for another community is they knew that this is a rotten place to store radioactive waste, and yet that's what they're doing. So, and another thing I'd just like to tack on here is that when you hear people say that background radiation is harmless, or imply that background radiation is harmless, that's crazy. Background radiation is one of the most harmful things there is. The radon is killing tens of thousands of people every year. Polonium is killing hundreds of thousands of people every single year. So to say that background radiation is harmless is simply ignorant.
Okay, thank you, Gordon. I'm just going to intervene and put a question to Tracy. Tracy, just to put you on the spot. I'm just wondering about that 2008 opposition to uranium mining. Was it, how much of it was related to uranium? and how much of it was related to just mining in general and the idea that mining companies could just, stake out your land. Do you remember what the discussion was at that time?
Well, I think it was both, but I think people were really concerned about uranium and the effects, the special effects of uranium. People in Harvey, like I talked about, who were worried about radon in their basements. So we're also now having uranium being staked on their claims being staked on their properties. So I do remember, that it was a time when people first learned that about subsurface mineral rights not being theirs, and this continues to this day. Like I still get calls from people that just find out that their properties have been claimed, but given them the media attention around the campaign, a lot of people found out that way. And I would say, that it was both. That people didn't want their properties mined, but that they were also especially concerned about uranium.
Okay, thank you. Great. I do see that, Lorraine, you have your hand up, and so does Gordon. So I just wondered if you wanted to add to any of the questions that have been asked so far before I go on to a new question.
Oh, thank you very much, Susan. I just saw, that we were getting on a discussion about the transport and disposal of waste that's created by the nuclear industry. And that's something that we're dealing with now at Chalk River. But it's something that goes back, to the first siting task force that I talked about earlier. It was called the Low Level Radioactive Waste Siting Task Force, and it came to no conclusion, even though communities were vying for being a host site. They were desperate for jobs and thinking that this was an opportunity for them. And if we look at the Lewiston Waste Management Facility in New York State, I think it only created two part-time jobs with monitors coming in periodically just to check levels. But at that time, and it was interesting because at that time, when they started the siting task force, it was actually a sociology project. It was a premise about how to, I think it was the precursor to the disposal of the spent fuel rod exercise. So there was some social theories about how you could get communities to put their hand up and say, yes, I'll take your garbage. So there's a lot of social science that has gone into this exercise, which I think is interesting too. And it's, marketing and bamboozling and whatever else is going on. So I just wanted to say that because it is the current issue that many Indigenous communities are facing right now.
Okay, Lorraine, stay on there because we have a question. So obviously you've talked about your concern with the tailing dams breaking and releasing effluent, like the ones at Mount Poly. What actually would happen if they broke? Like what would be the, oh, sorry, I don't mean.
It would be a nightmare. It would, like in the 1970s, the International Joint Commission on Great Lakes Water Quality flagged Lake Huron as an area of concern because the effluent was running untreated through the Serpent River watershed, migrating into Lake Huron. And so at some point, and it's interesting because at some point in time, the International Joint Commission stopped monitoring for radionuclides in the Great Lakes. Anyway, so there is migration and effluent dumping into Lake Huron now. It's just not being measured. But if those dams were to collapse, it would just be a monumental disaster. That you think about size, they're on fault lines. There's a fault, the Murray Fault runs through that area. I can't even imagine, the devastation that would be caused. Like how, but I think it's what Gordon said, it's the slow migration of the poison, right? And that the decay chain is active. So But I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but Gore can talk to that about what that stuff will become over time.
Thank you. And thanks, Lorraine. I noticed, Gordon, you have your hand up. Did you want to add to anything?
Yeah, I wanted to add something to what Tracy was saying about the situation in New Brunswick. The upsurge in activity and exploration in New Brunswick was happening all around the world, really, and it was happening all around North America. I went to Virginia. We here in Quebec had a public hearings. The Cree Nation was involved, took a leading role. Medical doctors played a leading role in shooting that resurgence of uranium mining exploration down. It was totally based on a fictitious price rise. The price soared up to a very high number, and that's what stimulated all these small companies to want to mine uranium because of the price. But it was all predicated on the idea that there was going to be a nuclear renaissance, which turned out to be a fiasco. It never happened. And so the price shot right down again, and everybody went back to sleep. But with the talk about small modular reactors, it would not be surprising with our government beating the drum about small modular reactors, which probably are not going to work anyway, but it could still stimulate another surge in uranium exploration. So New Brunswick could be in for another surge. Now in Quebec, fortunately, we managed to get a moratorium. In Virginia, they upheld a moratorium. New Brunswick doesn't have a moratorium, but that would be a good thing for people to keep their eye on, because this monster is going to come back again, even if the small modular reactors are a pipe dream and turn out to be uneconomic and unviable. You could still get a lot of damage done to your communities.
Thank you, Gordon. I have another question for you. You answered it partly about, and I've seen some criticism in the chat that we're talking about historical situations. And the question is, have the hazards from uranium mining been mitigated by modern safety methods and equipment?
Yeah, they certainly have. I mean, prior to 1978, there had been 30 uranium tailings dam failures in the Elliot Lake region that were reported in the press. And there were very sloppy techniques that were used. The radon exposures for the workers were absolutely criminal. But it was only as a result of activists putting their bodies on the line and workers standing up for their rights that anything got improved. So the industry likes, and the government both like to boast about improvements that have been made without saying that they resisted those improvements every step of the way. So the only way improvements get made is if people fight for it. And that's the sad truth of the matter. And so it doesn't pay anybody. It's just people have to feel that it's their civic duty to really fight for this. And only then do you get things done. Okay. But there have been improvements, there's no doubt. The tailings are much better managed now, and the tailings but they're going to be around for hundreds of thousands of years. These people who pass these legislations are not going to be around. So who's going to look after it 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years from now?
Okay, thanks, Gordon. I'm going to just continue on with you here. There's a question about, how can we do environmentally sound uranium mining, because the issue is, don't we still need it for medical use, and shouldn't we do it in Canada rather than doing it in other countries?
Well, the answer is that very, very little uranium has ever been used for medical use. In fact, for example, people say that the most widely used medical isotope in the world is technetium-99m. There were only 5 nuclear reactors in the entire world that are producing the whole world supply of technetium-99m, and none of them were power reactors, and none of them were large reactors. One of them was the NRU reactor at Chalk River, never produced electricity. So you don't need large power reactors at all for nuclear medicine. As a matter of fact, you don't even need reactors or uranium for a lot of isotopes, because you can produce them without either. You can produce them using cyclotrons and linear accelerators. And it's not a clear cut and dried case, because some things are difficult to produce without a reactor, but possibly we can do without those things if we phase out nuclear power. The main thing is that the amount of uranium that goes into producing medical isotopes is minuscule. It's a very tiny amount. And if you actually wanted to keep a few small reactors running solely for that purpose, you could perhaps do so. I don't think it's necessary. I've been advocating, and by the way, this this advocacy has become government policy in Canada. They've stopped producing isotopes at Chalk River using the NRU reactor, and they're now promoting the use of isotopes in technologies that don't require uranium or nuclear reactors.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm going to switch to Tracy again. Tracy, I know that you're teaching courses to young students in environmental issues, and I'm just wondering what you think their level of awareness is in New Brunswick, say, for example, of nuclear issues, and what do you think is going on there, or why do they see this or not see this as an environmental issue? Thank you.
Well, it's a good question. Well, I think yeah, well, we did have Susan did present to my classes, my first year environmental studies classes. Was that just last week? Yeah, and I think from the reactions from the students there, it was maybe clear that they knew very little about uranium, nuclear, about the proposals for the new nuclear reactors. It could be that they're not accessing information about it through their own channels of media, but they definitely were interested. There was a number of comments from students who actually lived near Point Lepreau or have family members that work at the Point Lepreau nuclear station, and they were really interested to learn about what one student said, the other side of the story. And I think that a number of the students do talk to me too about how their parents work in fossil fuels or nuclear, and that they are looking to a future that's free of that does respect the peace and friendship treaties, they see a different path, I think, and they're willing to fight for it too. And
thank you, Tracy. Okay, this is a general question about the uranium mining currently going on in Canada. There's questions about if it is going on. Brene, I think I'm going to ask you answered this question in the chat about where uranium mining is happening now in Canada primarily. Brene, sorry, I can't remember what I said, but if you can just unmute yourself and answer that. Thank you.
Yeah, in the process. So the uranium mining that continues in Canada is in the Athabasca Basin in northern Saskatchewan, and it's a much higher grade uranium than the uranium that was mined in Elliot Lake. So the environmental consequences of that mining is, of really high concern.
Thanks, Brene. Okay, another question more for, I guess for Lorraine. Yes, oh yeah, Lorraine, this one is about Rosalie Bertel and her work. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, about the impacts that, the influence that Rosalie Bertel had on educating people. Would you care to answer that?
Oh, thank you very much. So I think I have to go back to when I was, when I was a young journalist, and I would reach out to people, including Sister Rosalie Bertel, and I think maybe even Gord Edwards, and I think there was a Dr. Arjan Makajani from the US. So I had to rely, and back then in the day we had to use fax and telephone. But I had to rely on the expertise of scientists to guide me in my work. And I met Dr. Bertel when she came to do some epidemiology work at Blind River after Cameco had an uncontrolled release. And industry sometimes has uncontrolled releases of radioactive material over long weekends on holidays. Sometimes that happens. So I think the teachers that came before me are very important in terms of the legacy and the history of uranium in Canada and the impacts. So she is I'm sorry, she was instrumental in educating a lot of us who were activists. So, and I was thinking about that today as we were talking, as many of us are getting older, what do we leave behind for the next generation to follow in terms of the knowledge and experience that we have? Because most of us are activists or in nonprofit organizations and on the margins, not able to produce volumes of information and share that history, because it is a legacy that we're leaving for the next generation. So I'm ever grateful to the work. And so it was the International Institute of Concern for Public Health that took an interest primarily in Indigenous experiences with the nuclear industry.
Thank you. I noticed we have 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to give panelists an opportunity to, if you have any final thoughts or any advice for people listening to this who want to get active on these issues, or anything you could just choose to share. We'll do in the same order that the panel spoke. So I'll go to you first, Gordon, if you have any final thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to remind people that the only really fundamentally essential use of uranium is nuclear weapons. Every other use of uranium has alternatives. We don't need uranium to produce electricity. There's many ways of producing electricity. We don't need uranium to produce isotopes. There's many ways of producing isotopes. We do need uranium for nuclear weapons. There's no other way of making nuclear weapons without starting with uranium. And that's where you might say, well, the trick there is not to use it for weapons, but to use it for peaceful purposes. Unfortunately, and when using it for peaceful purposes, the only other peaceful use really is to fuel nuclear reactors, and that inevitably produces plutonium. The uranium is converted to plutonium, and that remains around for hundreds of thousands of years and will be available for making nuclear weapons again. So we are spreading literally the seeds of our own destruction by embarking and continuing on this path. It's a very dangerous path, and if we continue to proliferate it, I'm afraid the world is not going to be able to pull back from the brink ever. We all see that the global warming crisis has got to the crisis point. If we don't act now, we're not going to succeed. Nuclear can't help us in that regard because it's way too slow and way too expensive. We've got to turn to renewables because that's where we should be headed anyway. But with regard to nuclear weapons, many people forget that that's an equally dangerous situation for the human race. We could destroy the Earth's environment in a matter of hours using nuclear weapons. And this is not getting better. This is getting worse right now because we now have trillions of dollars earmarked for accelerating the building of nuclear weapons. I urge people to bear this in mind, that it's not worth whatever advantages might be put forward for nuclear power. We have alternatives. We should use those alternatives. We should shut down this stuff until we get a peaceful world with no nuclear weapons. Then perhaps we can renegotiate. But to continue as with business as usual is just sealing our own doom, I believe.
Thank you, Gordon. Lorraine, I'll turn it to you for final thoughts.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks, Gordon and Tracy, for sharing this space with me. I saw the slide that Tracy put up. It was the Miners Memorial at Elliot Lake, and my father's name is on there. So it was a little bit emotional for me to see that. And like she said, I mean, we filed a compensable claim for his death, and it was denied by Workplace Compensation Board in Ontario. And the death benefit for a dead miner in Elliot Lake was $35,000, and the claim was denied. And so I submitted excerpts that I had taken out of the BEER 5 report, so biological effects of ionizing radiation. I think it was BEER 5 or BEER 7. But these documents are so helpful to people that work, lay people that work on the ground, like spreadsheets or fact sheets or anything that people can produce to assist in the fight. And we are being bamboozled. When Gordon was talking, I was just thinking, power, politics, pollution, and plutonium. And I saw my father as a victim of, political and money grubbing schemes to defraud the Canadian taxpayer out of their money, because those mines were subsidized with cost plus guaranteed government contracts. And the mine owners walked away like bandits. So this is about power. It is about money. It's not about energy or the common good or combating climate change. And I think we need to see through the bullshit, right? And that it is bamboozling us to get our tax dollars in someone else's pocket at the end of the day and leave us with the environmental destruction.
Thank you, Lorraine. Tracy, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, first I want to thank Lorraine for sharing her personal story. And I totally agree with Lorraine that this is about power. It's about capitalism. I think the only way that uranium or nuclear energy makes sense is because we live under capitalist social relations. Like Gordon pointed out, it's too slow, too expensive. It's not a climate solution. I see in the Q&A that some people named some well-known folks who are advocates of nuclear, but I don't know why they think that this is a solution. I think it doesn't make sense to me. It's not just us that's talking about how nuclear power is not a climate solution. There are, the Solutions Project that, has done all this research that shows that we can move to a renewable energy future in a short time without nuclear. There's that research. So yeah, I think while we need to organize against harmful energy sources as part of a real just energy transition, we also need to be looking at the systems that we live under and really revolutionizing those systems. And it's not just, the radical activists that are saying this, like when the IPCC talks about how we need, a system change, in all the ways that we live, transportation, energy, food. I think we need to heed those that advice. Sorry, and I just want to thank Dr. Susan O'Donnell, who's doing so much work here in New Brunswick to oppose these new nuclear reactors that are a waste of taxpayer dollars, but also would again violate the peace and friendship treaties. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you. I would just, thank you, Tracy. I would just like to again thank our panelists, Gordon Edwards, Lorraine Rekmans, and Tracy Glynn for their excellent presentation and engagement. We still have 114 people on this, so I'm just really pleased that so many of you are interested in this topic. And on behalf of of the hosts, which is the Raven Project at the University of New Brunswick, the Environment and Society Program at St. Thomas University, Prevent Cancer Now, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, and the NB Media Co-op, I'd just like to say thank you, all of you, and you'll be hearing from us soon. Thank you. Bye now.